A flight attendant refuses to help an elderly black woman, only to uncover a shocking truth minutes later. In today's video, we explore an unforgettable event on a routine flight, one that started with a simple request and ended with a twist no one saw coming. If you enjoy stories of resilience and justice, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Your feedback motivates me to bring you more heartwarming and impactful tales. Now, let's dive into the story. The Westbridge International Airport was alive with its usual energy, the hum of announcements, hurried footsteps, and the rolling of luggage wheels blending into a familiar rhythm. Among the bustling crowd was Mrs. Lorraine Carter, an elderly black woman in her late 70s. She moved with quiet grace, her neatly pressed blue dress complementing her gentle smile. Her cane, a sturdy yet well-worn companion, rested in her hand as she made her way to the gate. Lorraine handed her boarding pass to the gate agent, who barely looked up from his screen. 22B, he said in a flat tone, gesturing toward the jet bridge without so much as a smile. Thank you, Lorraine said softly, her voice steady despite the faint tremble of her hands. Her small carry-on bag, though light for most, carried essentials she couldn't risk losing: a book, some snacks, and an assortment of medications that kept her health in check. Stepping into the aircraft, Lorraine welcomed the cool air, a refreshing escape from the crowded terminal. She paused near the door, glancing at the narrow aisle ahead. Passengers were already settled, filling the rows with chatter and the sounds of luggage being stowed in bins overhead. Bins that, to her dismay, were already packed. Lorraine's eyes scanned for help and landed on a flight attendant standing nearby. The young woman, whose polished uniform displayed her name tag, Mallory Briggs, flashed a professional smile that faded as quickly as it appeared. "Excuse me, miss," Lorraine said politely, her voice gentle but clear. "Could you help me put my bag up there? My arms aren't as strong as they used to be." Mallory's expression changed instantly. Her initial smile turned into a look of impatience, her eyes sweeping over Lorraine with thinly veiled annoyance. "Ma'am, passengers are encouraged to handle their own luggage," Mallory said curtly, gesturing dismissively toward the overhead bin. "It's airline policy." Lorraine blinked, surprised by the response. "I understand," she said, her voice faltering slightly. "But I really can't lift this. It's a bit heavy for me." Mallory let out a dramatic sigh, loud enough that nearby passengers turned to watch the exchange. Her stiff posture radiated irritation. "Fine," she muttered under her breath, making no move to help directly. Instead, Mallory turned to a young man who had just settled into his seat 2 rows ahead. "Sir," she called sharply, "could you assist her with her bag?" Her tone was clipped and transactional, as though the task was beneath her. Caught off guard, the young man looked up quickly and nodded. "Of course," he replied kindly, standing and lifting Lorraine's bag into the overhead compartment with ease. Lorraine offered him a grateful smile, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. "Thank you so much," she murmured, her voice soft. "You're very welcome," the man replied warmly before sitting back down. Lorraine adjusted her grip on her cane, avoiding the gaze of Mallory, who had already turned away without another word. Her demeanor gave no indication that she cared about Lorraine's struggle or the moment of discomfort she had caused. As Lorraine made her way down the aisle to her seat, 22B, she could feel the weight of nearby stares. Some passengers offered faint, polite smiles, but most were absorbed in their phones or conversations, too preoccupied to notice the silent humiliation lingering in her steps. She finally reached her seat and lowered herself carefully, wincing as her knee protested from the movement. Her cane leaned against the armrest as she adjusted her small shawl and took a deep breath. Lorraine glanced out the window at the wide tarmac below, usually a comforting sight. But today, the view did little to ease the sting of the encounter. For someone who had spent a lifetime facing hardships with grace, Mallory's cold indifference was just another reminder of how quickly dignity could be dismissed. But neither Mallory, nor anyone else on that flight, knew who Lorraine Carter really was, and how, soon enough, the power balance would shift in ways they couldn't have imagined. Lorraine Carter carefully made her way down the aisle, her cane tapping softly against the floor as she passed rows of indifferent faces. A few passengers offered polite, fleeting smiles, but most were too absorbed in their phones, headphones, or quiet conversations to notice her struggle. She finally arrived at 22B, an aisle seat. Lowering herself into the seat with measured care, Lorraine winced slightly as a sharp twinge shot through her knee, a painful reminder of her arthritis. She adjusted her small shawl around her shoulders and let out a shaky breath. The familiar hum of the captain's voice crackled over the intercom, welcoming passengers and announcing the flight's details. Lorraine turned her gaze to the window. The tarmac outside usually brought her comfort, a reminder of her journeys over the years. But today, that comfort was clouded by an unease she couldn't shake. The cold dismissal from Mallory Briggs, the flight attendant, still stung more than she wanted to admit. This flight felt different, not longer in time, but in the way it made her feel small and invisible. The airplane had been airborne for just under an hour when Lorraine felt the familiar pang in her chest. The cabin air was dry, and she knew it was time for her medication. Glancing up, she eyed the small call button overhead. She hesitated. Lorraine never liked drawing attention to herself, but she also knew how important it was to stay on schedule with her pills. With a soft sigh, she pressed the button. A chime echoed faintly overhead, and Lorraine folded her hands neatly in her lap, waiting patiently. Minutes passed. She watched as Mallory Briggs moved briskly up and down the aisle, distributing drinks and snacks to passengers with an air of practiced efficiency. But Mallory didn't stop at Lorraine's seat. The light above her blinked on, unnoticed or ignored. Lorraine shifted uncomfortably, her eyes darting to the passengers around her. Everyone else received polite smiles and quiet exchanges as Mallory handed out their drinks, but Lorraine's call light remained unanswered. Finally, after what felt like far too long, Mallory appeared at her seat. Her expression was blank, but her presence carried an unmistakable impatience. "Yes, ma'am?" Mallory asked flatly, standing close enough that Lorraine had to tilt her head back to meet her gaze. Lorraine's voice was soft, almost apologetic. "I'm sorry to bother you, but could I have a cup of water, please? I need to take my medication." Mallory's brow arched slightly, and her tone turned clipped. "We'll be coming through with drink service shortly," she said, her voice devoid of warmth. "You can wait until then." Lorraine blinked, startled by the abrupt reply. "It's just," she began carefully, "I really need to take it now, if it's not too much trouble." Mallory's expression hardened, her voice sharpening as she interrupted. "I already said, we'll be serving drinks soon. I can't drop everything for one person." The word struck Lorraine like a slap. Her grip on her cane tightened, her knuckles pale against the smooth wood. "I understand," Lorraine said softly, her voice trembling despite her efforts to keep it steady. "But it's important for my health." Mallory let out a loud, audible sigh, drawing the attention of a man seated across the aisle, a businessman in a dark suit. His brow furrowed as he observed the exchange, clearly unimpressed. Mallory rolled her eyes slightly when she noticed his stare, then turned back to Lorraine. "Fine," she muttered under her breath, her voice laced with irritation. She stalked off briskly, leaving Lorraine to wait in silence. When Mallory returned after what felt like an eternity, she carried a small plastic cup of water. Without a word, she set it down on Lorraine's tray table with an abrupt motion, spilling a few drops onto the surface. "Here," Mallory said tersely, before walking away without a backward glance. Lorraine stared at the cup for a moment, her hands trembling slightly. Slowly, she took her medication in silence, her eyes fixed downward. A lump formed in her throat as she fought to hold back tears. The pill may have eased her condition, but it couldn't heal the ache Mallory's coldness had caused. Across the aisle, the businessman leaned over slightly, his voice low and full of concern. "Ma'am, are you all right?" Lorraine managed a faint, weary smile. "I'm fine, thank you," she replied softly. But Lorraine wasn't fine. The weight she felt wasn't from her arthritis or her medications. It was the sting of being made to feel invisible, insignificant. A lifetime of challenges had taught her how to endure moments like this, but they never hurt any less. The businessman frowned, watching as Mallory continued down the aisle, oblivious to the small storm she had created. He shook his head in disbelief, muttering under his breath, "Unbelievable." As the flight settled into its mid-journey lull, passengers busied themselves with movies, books, or idle conversation. The cabin hum was a mixture of soft voices, the low drone of the engines, and the occasional clink of drink service trays. Mrs. Lorraine Carter sat quietly in her aisle seat, her gaze fixed on the rolling clouds outside the window. She tried to push the earlier incident with Mallory Briggs from her mind, but the humiliation still lingered like a shadow she couldn't shake. Lorraine shifted in her seat, wincing as the stiffness in her joints began to build. Her back ached, the discomfort spreading slowly, as it often did on long flights. She looked up at the call button, hesitated for a moment, then pressed it once more, hoping for even the smallest kindness, a cushion or a warm blanket. The small light above her seat blinked, signaling her request, but minutes passed with no response. Across the aisle, a young mother pressed her own call button moments later. Mallory appeared almost instantly, her demeanor bright and cheerful as she handed the woman a bottle of water and offered a reassuring smile. Lorraine watched quietly, her heart sinking. The difference in treatment wasn't lost on her. Surely Mallory had seen her call light. When the flight attendant walked back down the aisle moments later, Lorraine mustered the courage to speak up. "Excuse me, miss," she said softly, her voice just loud enough to carry over the hum of the plane. Mallory stopped abruptly, turning her head slowly as if the request had interrupted something far more important. Her lips tightened. "Yes?" Lorraine swallowed hard, trying to sound polite. "I'm sorry to trouble you, but could I trouble you for a blanket? My back is starting to hurt." Mallory's eyes narrowed slightly, her tone flat and dismissive. "We don't have enough for everyone," she replied curtly, making no effort to check the overhead bins. "You should have brought one if you needed it." Lorraine blinked, stunned. She hadn't expected warmth, but the sharpness of Mallory's words cut deep. "I didn't realize it would be so cold," Lorraine said quietly, her voice almost apologetic. Without another word, Mallory turned on her heel and walked away, leaving Lorraine sitting there, her shoulders slumping just a little more. An hour stretched on, feeling like a small eternity. Mallory never returned with a blanket, or with an apology. Instead, Lorraine watched her tend to other passengers with bright smiles and cheerful banter, offering drinks and conversation as though Lorraine wasn't even there. It wasn't just inattentiveness. Lorraine could feel it in her bones. Mallory's actions were deliberate, calculated. Every slight, every sharp word, every moment of being ignored chipped away at her dignity. She sat quietly, her hands folded neatly over her cane as she endured the ache in both her back and her spirit. The sound of rattling meal carts broke the stillness as the attendants began serving lunch. Lorraine sat up slightly, grateful for the distraction. But as the cart reached her row, she watched with disbelief as Mallory glanced at her, then simply moved on to the next passenger without stopping. Lorraine's hand trembled as she raised it slightly. "Excuse me," she said, her voice shaking. "I believe I was missed." Mallory stopped the cart abruptly, letting out an exaggerated sigh. Her expression was one of irritation as she turned back. "Oh, right," she said flatly, as though Lorraine's presence was an inconvenience she had forgotten. "What do you want? Chicken or pasta?" "Chicken, please," Lorraine replied, her tone cautious, as though she were afraid to say the wrong thing. Without care, Mallory slapped the meal tray down onto Lorraine's table. The tray rattled from the force, and a few passengers nearby looked up in surprise. Mallory didn't bother to make eye contact or offer any of the usual pleasantries. "There," she said curtly, pushing the cart forward before Lorraine could even thank her. Lorraine stared at the tray in front of her, her appetite gone. Her hands trembled slightly as she rested them on her cane, grounding herself in the familiar weight of it. Around her, whispers began to ripple quietly. A woman seated behind Lorraine leaned forward, her voice low and concerned. "Are you all right, ma'am? That was uncalled for." Lorraine forced a tight smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "I'm fine," she whispered back, though her voice cracked slightly under the strain. Across the aisle, the man in the suit who had observed the earlier interaction narrowed his eyes at Mallory as she moved further down the plane. His jaw tightened in frustration, and he muttered under his breath, "Unbelievable." Lorraine sat in silence, her meal untouched. She clenched her cane tightly, drawing strength from it, though her heart ached. A lifetime of resilience had taught her to endure indignities like this, but it didn't make them hurt any less. What Mallory Briggs didn't know, what no one else on that flight realized, was that Lorraine Carter wasn't just a frail, elderly woman traveling alone. She was the mother of a man whose influence reached further than anyone on that plane could imagine. And soon, that influence would come to bear in ways no one could anticipate. The sting of Mallory Briggs's behavior weighed heavily on Lorraine Carter's heart. Each careless word and dismissive gesture had cut deeper than the flight attendant could ever know. But what Mallory didn't realize was that the frail woman she had brushed aside was not alone. Lorraine had a son who cherished her above all else. When he learned of what had transpired, the consequences would be swift, deliberate, and unrelenting. The plane touched down with a slight jolt, the familiar screech of the landing gear signaling the end of the journey. Around Lorraine, passengers began shifting in their seats, stretching, gathering their belongings, and chatting quietly in anticipation of disembarking. Lorraine, however, sat quietly, her fingers gripping the handle of her cane. Her spirit felt heavier than the small bag tucked into the overhead bin, burdened not by its weight, but by the events of the flight. When the seatbelt sign finally dimmed, Lorraine glanced upward at the bin. To her, it seemed impossibly high. Balancing herself carefully with her cane, she stood, her frail body struggling to keep steady. She looked around, hoping for someone to help her retrieve her carry-on. The young man across the aisle, who had been watching her with concern throughout the flight, immediately rose to assist. "Let me help you, ma'am," he said kindly, reaching toward the bin. Before he could lift the bag down, Mallory appeared beside him, her voice sharp and authoritative. "Sir, please remain seated until the passengers in front of you have exited," she snapped, her tone far more severe than necessary. The young man hesitated, glancing at Lorraine, who looked small and weary in the narrow aisle. "I'm just trying to help her," he explained, gesturing toward her bag. Mallory crossed her arms tightly, her posture rigid. "We have procedures, and everyone needs to follow them," she said firmly. Her gaze flicked to Lorraine. Passengers should wait their turn or be prepared to manage their own belongings. Lorraine's face burned with humiliation as the young man reluctantly retook his seat, his expression apologetic. Mallory, meanwhile, stood motionless, offering neither help nor concern. Taking a shaky breath, Lorraine reached for the bag herself, stretching her thin arms upward. The strain sent a sharp pain through her shoulder, but she tried again, determined not to let Mallory's indifference defeat her. The bag slipped from her grasp, tumbling forward and landing with a dull thud on the edge of the seat. Its contents spilled into the aisle, medication bottles rolling across the carpet, and a neatly folded scarf fluttering down like a fallen leaf. Passengers turned, their conversations falling silent as a murmur of concern rippled through the rows. Mallory, standing just a few feet away, let out a dramatic sigh as though the scene unfolding before her was an unbearable inconvenience. "Oh, for heaven's sake," she muttered under her breath, bending down, not to assist Lorraine with care, but to gather the scattered items with cold efficiency. She shoved the bottles back into the bag and thrust it toward Lorraine without meeting her eyes. "Here," she said curtly before turning on her heel and walking away, her indifference absolute. Lorraine accepted the bag, her hands trembling as she secured it carefully. The weight of the other passengers' gazes pressed against her. Some were sympathetic, others merely curious. She could feel their stares, but she forced herself to hold her head high. She had endured far worse in her lifetime. This moment, though painful, would not break her resolve. When she finally exited the aircraft and entered the bustling jet bridge, the cool air touched her cheeks like a small mercy. The chaos of the terminal beyond surrounded her, but waiting at the end of the bridge stood Nicholas Carter, her son. Nicholas was a commanding presence, even amid the crowded terminal. Tall, with broad shoulders and a tailored charcoal suit, he was impossible to overlook. The polished leather of his shoes gleamed under the overhead lights, but it was his face that drew attention, sharp and serious, softened only by the deep concern in his eyes. When Nicholas saw his mother, his expression shifted. He stepped forward quickly, reaching for her bag with practiced ease. "Mom," he said warmly, his voice low and steady. "How was the flight?" Lorraine hesitated. The words caught in her throat as she looked into her son's searching eyes. She forced a faint smile, as though trying to shield him from the truth. "It's fine, dear," she replied softly, though her voice wavered. Nicholas' brow furrowed slightly as he studied her face. The slight slump in her posture, the tremor in her hands, he noticed everything. His mother had always carried herself with quiet strength, but today something was different. Something had hurt her. Nicholas said nothing, but his jaw tightened as he turned to guide her through the terminal. He didn't need to press her for details. He knew his mother too well. Lorraine Carter may have been dismissed on that flight, but she was no ordinary passenger. Nicholas's calm demeanor masked the storm brewing beneath the surface, one that Mallory Briggs and the airline were about to feel in ways they could never anticipate. The weight of humiliation lingered like a storm cloud as Lorraine Carter and her son Nicholas made their way through the bustling terminal. Nicholas walked at her side, carrying her small bag without hesitation, but his sharp eyes darted to her cane, her trembling hands, and the weariness etched into her expression. "Mom," Nicholas said gently as they reached the quiet curb outside the terminal. His tone was soft but firm. "What happened?" Lorraine shook her head slightly, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's fine, dear." Nicholas's brow furrowed deeply. He knew his mother too well to believe her. For as long as he could remember, Lorraine Carter had been the picture of quiet strength, a woman who could endure almost anything. But the way she avoided his gaze, the way her hands gripped the handle of her cane just a little too tightly, told him otherwise. "Are you sure?" Nicholas pressed, his tone a little firmer this time. "It's nothing," Lorraine said, forcing a small smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Let's just go home." But Nicholas wasn't convinced. His mind raced, piecing together the unspoken clues, the slight tremor in her voice, the tightness of her posture, and the airline logo on the boarding pass he had glimpsed earlier in her bag. The familiar emblem made his jaw clench. If something had happened to his mother during that flight, someone was going to answer for it. The drive home was unusually silent. Nicholas kept glancing at his mother from the corner of his eye, the quiet tension filling the space between them like an invisible weight. His mother sat with her head turned toward the window, her fingers tracing the edges of her shawl as though to anchor herself. As they pulled into her driveway, Nicholas broke the silence, his voice gentle but insistent. "Mom, I know something happened on that flight. Please, don't keep it to yourself." Lorraine sighed quietly as she unfastened her seatbelt. Her movements were slow and deliberate, the toll of the day's events unmistakable. She turned to face him, her cane resting against the car door. "Nicholas," she began softly, her voice carrying the quiet weariness of someone who had faced far too much. "It was nothing I couldn't handle. I've faced worse." Her words, though spoken with resolve, struck Nicholas like a blow. His jaw tightened, and his knuckles whitened as his hands gripped the steering wheel. "Don't brush this off, Mom," he said, his voice low but steady. "I need to know what happened." Lorraine hesitated, her eyes glistening as the emotions she had tried so hard to suppress finally broke through. She recounted the events of the flight, the dismissive tone of Mallory Briggs, the refusal to help, the humiliation of her belongings spilling into the aisle while passengers stared. Her voice trembled as she described how small she had felt, how every interaction had chipped away at her dignity. Nicholas listened in silence, his expression unreadable, but the tension radiating from his body was impossible to ignore. By the time Lorraine finished, his grip on the steering wheel had left faint indentations. "I see," Nicholas said quietly, exhaling slowly to steady himself. He sat back, his sharp gaze fixed on the street outside, his mind already moving like a well-oiled machine. "Thank you for telling me, Mom," he said finally, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable edge of steel. "You didn't deserve that. No one does." Lorraine placed a gentle hand on his arm, her touch warm despite the day's strain. "Nicholas, promise me you won't make a fuss," she said softly. "It's over now." Nicholas forced a tight, reassuring smile and kissed her hand softly. "Don't worry about it, Mom. I'll take care of it." His words were layered with meaning, a quiet promise that this injustice wouldn't stand. Once Nicholas ensured his mother was comfortably settled inside her home, he returned to his car. Sitting in the darkened driveway, he pulled out his phone. Years of leadership in the corporate world had honed his sharp mind, and he knew exactly what needed to be done. He wasn't just her son, he was Nicholas Carter, the majority shareholder of Aero World Airlines, the very airline his mother had flown on. He dialed a number, his expression grim. After a few rings, a groggy voice answered on the other end. "Nicholas?" came the uncertain voice of Alan Green, the airline's chief operating officer. "Good evening, sir. Is everything all right?" "No, Alan," Nicholas replied, his tone measured but icy. "Everything is not all right." Alan hesitated, caught off guard by the sharpness in Nicholas's voice. I'm sorry to hear that. What happened?" "My mother just flew on one of our flights, and she was treated with utter disrespect by a member of the crew," Nicholas said, his voice calm but cutting. "I need you to arrange an emergency meeting with the leadership team first thing tomorrow morning." Alan's voice faltered slightly. "Of course, sir. I'll notify the team immediately. Do you have details about—" "I'll provide all the details in the morning," Nicholas interrupted. "Make sure everyone's there. I expect this to be handled swiftly." "Yes, sir," Alan replied quickly, the tension in his voice unmistakable. "I'll take care of it personally." Nicholas hung up without another word. He leaned back in his seat, staring out into the stillness of the quiet street. This wasn't just business for him. Aero World Airlines was more than a company. It was a legacy he had worked tirelessly to build. A name meant to stand for excellence, inclusivity, and respect. That his own mother had been humiliated on one of its flights was an insult he couldn't ignore. Nicholas Carter wasn't seeking an apology. He was going to ensure this never happened again. Not to his mother, and not to anyone else. The thought of his own mother being mistreated under the banner of the company he had spent years building filled Nicholas Carter with cold resolve. This wasn't just about a mistake. It was about principle. He would ensure that no one else, least of all his mother, ever had to endure such indignity again. As he drove home that night, Nicholas's mind churned with plans. By morning, the flight crew and the entire company would understand exactly who they had disrespected. They would learn, in no uncertain terms, the cost of their actions. The next morning, the headquarters of Aero World Airlines hummed with unusual energy. Rumors of an emergency meeting had spread like wildfire, leaving a trail of unease among the staff. In the executive wing, the air was thick with tension as Alan Green, the chief operating officer, hurried down the hall. His face was pale and drawn, a product of a sleepless night spent preparing for the confrontation he knew was coming. Inside the large, sleek boardroom, the crew from Flight 452 sat at one end of the long table. Their expressions ranged from confusion to mild irritation. Mallory Briggs, the flight attendant at the center of the storm, sat with her arms crossed, her face set in a mask of defiance. Leaning toward a colleague, she whispered, "This is ridiculous. I didn't do anything wrong." Alan paced nervously near the head of the table, glancing at his watch. He hadn't told the crew the true purpose of the meeting, only that it concerned a high-priority customer incident. The ambiguity did little to calm the growing tension. Then the door swung open. The room fell instantly silent. Nicholas Carter entered, his presence commanding. Dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, he moved with deliberate purpose, each step echoing softly against the polished floor. He radiated calm, but there was no mistaking the intensity in his expression. It wasn't just anger, it was control. "Good morning," Nicholas said evenly, his deep voice carrying through the silent room. He took his place at the head of the table, his sharp gaze sweeping across the crew. For the first time, Mallory's defiance faltered. She sat up straighter, her arms uncrossing as though instinctively bracing for what was to come. Alan quickly slid into the seat beside Nicholas, fumbling with a folder of documents. Nicholas, however, ignored him. His hands rested on the table, his fingers interlocked as he addressed the room. "Before we begin," Nicholas said, his voice steady, "let me clarify something. This meeting isn't about a simple customer complaint. It's about an incident involving someone very important to me. My mother." The room froze. Mallory's face went pale as the weight of Nicholas's words sank in. She glanced nervously at her colleagues as though searching for an escape. "My mother, Lorraine Carter, was a passenger on Flight 452 yesterday," Nicholas continued, his tone unwavering. "She told me about the treatment she received from the crew on board. Silence enveloped the room, heavy and inescapable. The attendants exchanged panicked glances. Mallory, who just moments ago had appeared smug, looked visibly shaken. Nicholas leaned forward slightly, his voice sharpening. "Let me be perfectly clear. My mother is a strong, resilient woman who has faced more in her lifetime than most of you could imagine. But what she should never have to face, what no passenger should have to face, is humiliation and indifference at the hands of those representing this airline." Alan shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his gaze darting nervously toward the crew. Mallory opened her mouth as though to defend herself, but Nicholas's piercing gaze snapped to her, stopping her mid-breath. "Miss Briggs," Nicholas said coldly, his tone slicing through the air. "Do you remember Mrs. Carter?" Mallory swallowed hard, her bravado crumbling under his scrutiny. "I do," she stammered, her voice a faint echo of her earlier confidence. "But I didn't mean—" "You didn't mean what?" Nicholas interrupted, his voice rising ever so slightly. "You didn't mean to ignore her call light, to refuse to assist her, to watch as her belongings fell into the aisle and do nothing to help?" Mallory's mouth opened and closed, but no words came. Nicholas's voice lowered, but it was no less cutting. "Every action, every choice you made sent a message. You told my mother through your behavior that she was invisible, that she didn't matter." The silence in the room was suffocating, broken only by the sound of Mallory's quiet, unsteady breathing. Nicholas straightened, his gaze moving across the crew as he delivered his final words. "I hold every employee of this airline to the highest standard of care and respect," he said firmly. "Yesterday, that standard was ignored, and there will be consequences." The boardroom felt suffocating, the air heavy with tension. Nicholas Carter's words cut through the silence like a blade, each syllable deliberate and razor-sharp. "You, Miss Briggs, are a reflection of this airline," Nicholas said, his voice unwavering. "Your actions, or rather your inaction, told my mother and every passenger who watched exactly how little you valued her." Mallory's face turned pale, her lips parting as though to speak, but no words came. Her bravado, so present earlier, had crumbled completely under Nicholas's piercing gaze. "You allowed her belongings to spill into the aisle, and you stood by, indifferent." Nicholas's voice grew colder, the weight of his words pressing down on everyone in the room. "You ignored her health, her dignity, and in doing so, you failed not only as an employee, but as a person." Tears welled in Mallory's eyes, her hands gripping the edge of the table as though trying to anchor herself to reality. "Please, Mr. Carter," she managed to whisper, her voice trembling. "I didn't mean—" "Enough," Nicholas said firmly, cutting her off. His tone left no room for argument. "You've had your chance, Miss Briggs. Now it's time for consequences." He straightened, his sharp gaze sweeping across the room. "Effective immediately, Mallory Briggs is terminated." Mallory let out an audible gasp, her face flushing red with shock and shame. "Please," she started again, but Nicholas raised a hand to silence her. "I will not tolerate this kind of behavior in my airline," he said, his voice firm and final. Nicholas turned his attention to the remaining crew members, whose faces were etched with a mixture of fear and shame. "Let this serve as a lesson," he continued, his tone carrying the weight of his authority. "Every passenger who steps onto one of our planes deserves to be treated with dignity and respect, regardless of who they are or where they come from. If any of you fail to meet that expectation, you will not have a place here. Is that understood?" A soft chorus of murmured agreements filled the room as the crew nodded solemnly, their eyes downcast. Nicholas let the silence hang for a moment, his gaze lingering on each person. Then, with deliberate precision, he rose from his chair. "Meeting adjourned," he said coldly, turning on his heel and striding out of the boardroom. The door closed behind him with a soft thud, but the impact of his words reverberated like a storm. The boardroom remained eerily quiet. Mallory sat frozen, her face pale, her hands still gripping the edge of the table, as if she were trying to stop her crumbling reality from slipping further away. "I can't believe this," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Her colleagues avoided her gaze, as if unwilling to acknowledge the now dismissed flight attendant. One by one, they gathered their belongings and filed out of the room, leaving Mallory alone to face the harsh truth of her actions. The fallout from the emergency meeting was swift and widespread. Nicholas Carter's directive set an urgent tone that rippled across every department in Aeroworld Airlines. This wasn't just another customer service complaint. It was a reckoning. No one wanted to be caught on the wrong side of it. Within hours, Alan Green, the chief operating officer, convened his senior management team. The orders were clear. No stone would be left unturned. Flight 452 was placed under intense scrutiny, with every detail of the crew's performance examined under a microscope. As the investigation deepened, other grievances began to emerge. Passengers who had flown on the same flight came forward, citing inattentive service, rude interactions, and dismissive behavior. Patterns began to surface, and Mallory Briggs' name appeared repeatedly. The findings were damning. Mallory, it turned out, had a documented history of complaints. Passengers and colleagues alike had reported her behavior, but her supervisors, either out of negligence or a desire to avoid conflict, had failed to act. Under Nicholas Carter's relentless scrutiny, every crack in the system was laid bare. Reports came into his office hourly, each one shedding new light on the deeper cultural issues that had allowed such treatment to persist unchecked. Nicholas transformed his office into a command center for reform. With the precision of a surgeon, he pored over every document, identifying weak points and demanding immediate solutions. By the end of the day, Aeroworld Airlines was no longer the same company it had been just 24 hours earlier. Nicholas Carter had made his message clear. Respect and dignity were not optional. They were mandatory. Mallory Briggs' termination sent shockwaves through the airline, but it also served as a turning point. The staff now understood the true cost of complacency. This wasn't just about one passenger's experience. It was about ensuring that no one, no matter their age, race, or background, would ever feel invisible again. The preliminary report lay open on the polished desk in front of Nicholas Carter. Alan Green, the chief operating officer, stood nervously on the other side, waiting for Nicholas' response. Nicholas's sharp eyes scanned the document, his expression unreadable. He flipped through the pages methodically, absorbing every damning detail. Finally, he set the report down and fixed Alan with a steely gaze. "This isn't just about Mallory Briggs," Nicholas said, his voice calm but unrelenting. "This is about a culture that allowed her behavior to go unchecked." Alan swallowed nervously. "Yes, sir," he replied. "We've already begun implementing corrective measures." "Good," Nicholas said firmly, his tone leaving no room for excuses. "But this isn't just about fixing what's broken. It's about setting a new standard. Every employee, from the top down, must understand that respect and dignity are not optional. They're mandatory." Alan nodded quickly, scribbling notes onto a pad. "Understood, Mr. Carter. We'll ensure that message is clear across the board." Word of the airline's swift and decisive action spread rapidly. Passengers who had been on Flight 452 received personalized apologies, accompanied by vouchers for future travel. Many were impressed by the transparency and accountability Aeroworld Airlines displayed, so unlike the slow-moving bureaucracy often associated with the airline industry. The young man who had tried to assist Lorraine Carter shared his experience with friends and family. "I've never seen an airline take responsibility like this," he said. "It's clear they actually care about fixing things." Soon, glowing reviews and praise flooded social media. Though Nicholas had deliberately avoided making the situation public, the passengers' testimonies spoke volumes. The airline's reputation, tarnished by the incident, began to shift in a positive direction, earning newfound respect from customers and industry peers. Meanwhile, in a small, dimly lit apartment across the city, Mallory Briggs sat frozen at her dining table. The glow of her laptop screen illuminated her pale face as she stared at the email she had already read dozens of times. Subject line: Notice of termination. Employee conduct violation. The bold letters cut through her denial like a knife. She scanned the message again, hoping to find something she had missed. Your conduct on Flight 452 violated our company's standards of professionalism and customer care. Due to the severity of the complaints and subsequent findings during our investigation, your employment with Aeroworld Airlines is hereby terminated, effective immediately. Below, a list of incidents outlined her behavior in damning detail. Ignoring call lights, refusing to assist passengers, and displaying dismissive, unprofessional behavior. Mallory's hands trembled as she closed the laptop with a soft click. Her chest felt tight, her breaths shallow. The reality of her situation pressed down on her like an unbearable weight. 7 years. 7 years she had worked for the airline, believing her career was secure. Now it was gone, wiped away in a single moment, a result of choices she had made without considering the consequences. Days turned into weeks, and Mallory's life only grew smaller. The airline industry was a tight-knit world, and news of her termination spread quickly. Every job application she submitted was met with silence. Even positions outside the airline industry seemed out of reach. Her name had become synonymous with the very thing companies wanted to avoid: bad publicity. Bills piled up on her kitchen counter, and her savings dwindled at an alarming rate. The vibrant social life she had once enjoyed, full of energetic days and lively nights, vanished. Now, her days were long and quiet, filled with nothing but regret and endless self-reflection. Mallory began to avoid going out, terrified of running into former coworkers or anyone who might recognize her. The world outside her door seemed unwelcoming. The walls of her small apartment seemed to close in on her, suffocating her in her isolation. She spent hours replaying the events of that flight, dissecting every moment, every word. The arrogance she had worn like armor now felt like a chain around her neck, dragging her further into despair. For the first time, she was forced to confront the reality of her actions and the price of the indifference she had shown. Days after her termination, Mallory Briggs sat at her small dining table, staring blankly out the window. Below, the bustling city moved with its usual rhythm, cars honking, people rushing along the sidewalks. Her gaze settled on a delivery driver across the street. He had stopped to help an elderly woman cross, carefully balancing her bags as he guided her to the curb. The simple act of kindness was unremarkable to most, but for Mallory, it was like a blow to the chest. Tears filled her eyes as she realized the depth of her failure. She had been given countless opportunities to show the same compassion, to make someone's day a little easier, and yet she had squandered them all. Her downfall wasn't just about losing her job. It was about something deeper, losing sight of what it meant to be human. Mallory wiped her tears with the back of her hand, her heart heavy with regret. She knew there was no undoing the harm she had caused. No apology would erase the humiliation she had inflicted on Lorraine Carter or the way she had disregarded countless others. But as she sat there, she realized something important. She couldn't stay stuck in this place of guilt forever. She resolved to rebuild her life, piece by piece. She would start with the one thing she had ignored for so long: humility. Turning back to her laptop, Mallory opened a new browser tab. Her hands trembled slightly as she began searching for volunteer opportunities in her community. If she couldn't undo the past, she could at least start making amends. She could show kindness, one small act at a time. Days later, at the Carter family home, Nicholas Carter stood in his mother's garden, watching her tend to her beloved flowers. The morning sun bathed the garden in a golden glow, and the gentle hum of bees filled the warm air. Despite her age, Lorraine Carter moved with grace and precision, her hands steady as she trimmed the rose bushes. Nicholas watched her silently for a moment, his sharp gaze catching the faint weariness in her posture. Though the pain of the flight had passed, its memory lingered in ways she likely wouldn't admit. "Mom," Nicholas called softly, stepping onto the garden path with a small box in his hands. Lorraine looked up, her face breaking into a warm smile. "Nicholas, dear, what brings you here so early?" she asked, brushing soil from her gloves. Nicholas approached, his crisp suit in stark contrast to the soft garden setting. But the commanding presence he so often wore in the boardroom seemed softer now, more vulnerable. "I wanted to bring you something," he said, motioning for her to sit at the small garden table. Lorraine removed her gloves, curiosity lighting her eyes as she sat down. "You didn't have to go out of your way for me," she said playfully. Nicholas returned her smile, but his tone was serious. "Mom, what happened on that flight wasn't just an insult to you. It was an insult to everything you've taught me about treating people with respect and dignity. I've taken steps to make sure that kind of behavior is never tolerated again." Lorraine's expression softened, and she reached out to take his hand. "Nicholas, you didn't have to do all that. I'm just one passenger." No, Mom, Nicholas replied firmly, his voice thick with emotion. You're not just one passenger. You're my mother, and you deserve the best, just like anyone else. He gestured to the box on the table. Open it. Lorraine untied the ribbon carefully, her fingers trembling slightly with anticipation. Inside, she found a sleek leather folder embossed with gold lettering. Lifetime membership, Skylux Private Jet Services. Her breath hitched as she pulled out a personalized card with her name elegantly printed beneath the company's logo. To Mrs. Lorraine Carter, it read, a woman of grace, strength, and dignity. This lifetime membership ensures every journey is as comfortable and respectful as you deserve. With love and gratitude, Nicholas. Tears filled Lorraine's eyes as she looked up at her son. Nicholas, I don't know what to say, she whispered, her voice trembling. This is too much. Nicholas knelt beside her, taking her hand in his. It's not enough, he said softly. After everything you've done for me, everything you've sacrificed, this is just a small way of saying thank you. You'll never have to worry about being treated poorly again. Tears spilled over Lorraine Carter's cheeks as she pulled her son Nicholas into a tender hug. You've always been such a good son, she whispered, her voice breaking. This means more to me than I can say. Nicholas held her tightly, his own eyes misting. I love you, Mom, he said softly, and I'll always make sure you're taken care of. As the private jet soared smoothly above the clouds, Lorraine leaned back in her seat, a contented smile gracing her face. The hum of the engines was a soothing contrast to the cold indifference she had endured on that fateful flight. Looking out at the endless sky, Lorraine felt a peace she hadn't known in years. Her journey had transformed, not one of struggle but of renewal, proof of her son's love and the power of standing up for dignity and respect. Thank you for trusting me with this story. Let me know if you need any final adjustments or additional support.